Hello friends, this is FriendlyCosmonaut, and in this video we are going to be looking at objects and events and some basic programming logic. So if you were looking for a video about GameMaker setup and sprites and rooms, you might want to seek a different one because we are going to jump into this one as those things as assumed knowledge. So my project is pretty simple. It just has a few sprites and a room. You can see I've got this little bunny, I've got a background, a tree, and I've used that to create a very, very silly little world here. As you can see here, I've put all of these trees and positioned them and changed their scaling. I also have a little bunny here. I've got this background of a road, and then I have this sort of cover and a little question mark. So what I'm doing here is just a silly way to set up a little bit of a joke about why this bunny is crossing the road. And essentially, we're going to be using the logic of an object to turn this bunny into an object, have it move across here, and then get rid of this cover to reveal what is behind it and the punchline of the joke. And hopefully you can extend this greatly with your project if you have already a silly one set up with some assets, but feel free to just follow along with something similar. This is just so that we can get the fundamentals and understanding down. So let's do this by creating an object. So this is different to a sprite. An object, we can think of it as an actor. So it is capable of performing actions in the game. It is also capable of sort of listening to input from the user. So if we are clicking on it or using our keyboard or a controller or something like that, and having it actually respond to those controls. It might also respond to other things, such as other objects, colliding with other objects, certain timing, and then performing different actions therein. So these are really where the magic of the game happens. This is where we're going to be coding. It's where we are going to have all of our reactivity. So let's dive in. Let's right click over here. Like I said in the previous video, we can technically create this wherever we want. So it's not like I had to right click on the objects drop down. I could have just clicked outside of here or on any of the other folders. But for ease of organization, I'm going to keep all of my objects within that objects folder. So I'm going to click here. Now, at this point, it is worth having a little chat about how we are naming our assets. So in the previous video, I actually did not pay that any attention and I just went with the defaults. You will see now that I have named all of my sprites. So I have my bunny sprite here, for example, my tree, and all of the other ones. And I've also not only done that, but given them a prefix. So I've given them SPR. So that stands for sprite, and it's how I'm indicating that that resource is a sprite. And that is basically because GameMaker doesn't let us call two resources the exact same thing. So if I rename this object, for example, SPR tree, and hit enter, you will see that it comes up with invalid name. I've already used that. Names must be unique. So you will see that users of GameMaker tend to fall into using this standardization across their assets where people will name, for example, all of their sprites. They will give them the prefix SPR and then objects, for example, OBJ. Some might use just O for objects, S for sprite. It's essentially just good to keep it consistent. So try not to mix and match, and also don't stress too much about it. So if you start and just follow what I'm doing, for example, and you watch a different video and you like that model better, absolutely switch to it. That is totally fine. Because at the end of the day, the most important thing is that it makes sense to you as the user. So we just want the most efficient way of finding the resource and understanding what it is. So if you want to call all your objects silly little beans, and use that as a prefix, you go for that. I am going to be relatively boring and just use obj and then whatever the object name is. So I'm going to call mine obj bunny. So now I have my sprite SPR bunny and my object obj bunny. So this one is different to a sprite resource. So remember, a sprite is an image. It has properties to do with being an image. It's got pixels on it. It has a size. It has an animation speed. It has an origin and so on. An object does not have any of those things. So how it actually looks can just be changed. So it could be a bunny 1 minute and then a tree the next. We can always change how the object looks. At the moment, this object does not look like anything. So it starts off as a blank canvas. So we can actually assign a sprite to it, and I might go ahead and do that. I'm going to assign the SPR bunny. So it's going to draw that as its default. Again, we can change that later. For example, as it moves. So maybe I want it to look like it's running as it's moving or something like that. But yeah, for now, that object is going to draw this when we put it in the room. But let's actually get this object doing something. So let's have a look at this event panel right here. So a concept that we are going to return to again and again as fundamental for essentially all of the gameplay programming that we're going to do is if this, then that. If I push a button, move the object. If I collide with something, stop moving. So for now, our goal is to get the bunny to do something when we click on it. So if click, do something. So let's start there. Let's start in the event, which is what an event is. It's asking the question if something happens. Now, if I click on add event, here are essentially a bunch of triggers. So if I am created, if I am destroyed, if I click on this object, if I press a key. So in any of these events, we can then perform code or actions. Now, the one I'm going to start with right now is that input. So if we hover over this mouse one right here, we can see if I hold down the mouse, if I press, if I release, if I enter the object. So that would be if I sort of hover over it, if I then leave hovering over it, and so on. Now, like I said, we'll keep it simple for now, and I'm just going to do if I click on the object. So I'm going to use the left click and use that one. Now, when I do that, I get this little pop up. So this is asking us if we want to use GML code or GML visual. So these are two different ways of using logic in GameMaker. So we have a sort of visual language, or we can use actual code. So if you haven't coded before, or if you've struggled with some of the coding in this video or in others, it might be worth having a look at GML visual or visual coding. It can be a great way to get started, and you can always swap over to code later. And actually, GameMaker does have a way of previewing what the code would look like and sort of live translating the visual code into GML code. However, like I said, I'm not going to be going over that. I'm going to jump straight into GML code. So I'm going to just quickly explain what GML even is. So GML is a coding language. This one isn't really used outside of GameMaker, but it is very similar to another language called JavaScript. So not only does it follow a lot of the conventions of JavaScript, so if you learn GML and especially are using resources online from others who use GameMaker and GML, you will find that a lot of us adopt the practices and syntax of JavaScript, even though GML is a lot less strict. So I will talk about GML more at length in other videos, but I really want to just introduce some concepts today and get us up and running with some logic. Now, we might want to actually tick some of these so that we don't get this pop up anymore. Otherwise, every time we create a new event or code block, it's going to prompt us again if we want to use GML or visual. So feel free to tick them or don't. I will do that because I don't want to have those coming up. If you do tick don't ask again ever, that will kind of save that preference local to your computer. So even across projects, you will find that this will not pop up anymore. So again, if you're quite comfortable just going ahead with that and not using GML code, you will want to tick that right now. You can, of course, reset this in your preferences later. Okay, so once we have done that, you can see that this code block has popped up. So this is kind of the second half to our question that we posed earlier. So if this was the if we left click, then that is this code block. So this is where we actually get to respond and do something in response to the click. Now, so this little description that has come up here, so you can see we've got insert description here and you can write your code in this editor. So these are actually in what's called a comment. So comments are compiled out of the program before it runs. So we can write whatever we want in a comment, or put differently, we can also put very invalid code in a comment and it doesn't matter at all because it doesn't run during the game. The way that we do that is we just add these double slashes to whatever we write in these lines. So as soon as you do that, it transforms the line into a comment. So if you don't have that, that's when we have normal code. So if I write hello world, that is now interpreted as code in the game. So you can see also that GameMaker does not like what I've done right here because this is not a valid line of code. I can't actually do this. This isn't meaningful to GameMaker. And we're going to have to start thinking in terms of that. So while that makes sense to us to just write hello world, that's just something someone might say, it doesn't mean anything to the program. So the program is usually thinking in terms of properties and manipulating those properties. So it wants us to tell it to do things. It wants us to set properties. So x equals 2, or it can perform things. It can do functions, so it can move things around and so on. And the first one I'm going to teach you is to destroy the object. So delete it from existence. And the way that we do that in GameMaker is we write instance. And you can actually see as soon as we start writing things, we have what's called the autocomplete coming up. So all of these are possible functions that we could use. Things that we can do, things that we can get GameMaker to do. So here I am activating some instances. Here I am checking if things exist and so on. So there's lots of functions, lots of things that we can do with GML. So it's very easy to get overwhelmed as there are a lot, but especially as we're starting out, I encourage you to kind of just look at the ones that you need in the moment. Do it incrementally as we start to make a project. So if you decide, I want to make an object in a certain location, go ahead and Google, look for the function that does that, rather than trying to sort of consume the thousands of functions at any time. So like I said, we just want to get rid of the bunny. So let's do instance destroy. So instance underscore, so you're going to need to go shift and then the hyphen and destroy. Now we do have to be precise here. You can't just use a hyphen, you can't use a space. If you use a space, GameMaker will not understand what you're talking about. It has to be specific. It can't be capitalized, it all has to be underscore. You've got to be specific here. So not only that, but to actually run this function, it is called. So when it is orange like this, it is actually called a function. We also have to use these little brackets. So that will actually make GameMaker run the function, perform it, as opposed to just referencing it. So you might think of this as saying the word run versus actually doing the word run. Those are sort of different things. Now, for the last step is whether or not to use a semicolon. So this is another thing that we're going to have to get used to. And it is quite like the period or full stop at the end of a sentence. So it marks its completion, and that is often required for grammar. And if you are reading through a book and it does not have proper punctuation, you will find it very difficult to read. A computer will find it impossible. So it will error a lot of the time in other languages if you do not have the proper punctuation. Different languages have different punctuation needs as well. And on that note, JavaScript, like I said, the language that GML is kind of based on and the most reminiscent of, does require a semicolon. For that reason, the vast majority of tutorials and resources that you will find that use GameMaker and GML will follow JavaScript programming conventions. So they will teach you to program as if you were using JavaScript. And that's essentially to teach you good programming practice so that you can get used to programming not only in GameMaker, but also in JavaScript. So I'm going to follow suit and I am going to use that semicolon there, but it is worth pointing out that if I had not and I run this, GameMaker will not complain. It is not going to cause an error. So with that said, if we run the game right now, let's see if our code works. So as I said, I'd already set up my room with all of my sprite assets. And if I go ahead and click on the bunny, you can see that nothing happens. So it is not deleting itself. Certainly the picture isn't changing. So we might want to have a little think again about why this is. So why is this bug happening? It's not causing an error. So the game isn't crashing, but it's not, I guess, doing what I'm expecting, which is when I click on it, why isn't it destroying itself? Now, in this case, it is also worth having a think about how the game runs frame by frame. So let's consider when we hit the play button, we'll think about all of the contents of the room. So right now, let's have a look at our room. So we've got our asset layer, and that asset layer contains the sprites and the bunny sprite. It contains this background and this background as well. What it doesn't contain, you will find, is our object. So remember that our SPR bunny is different to OBJ bunny. SPR bunny is just a sprite and does not contain the capacity for any kind of action. So it just draws itself at a certain position at a certain scale and color. But remember, the actors are the things that can actually move and react and do things that are interesting. So if I bring the bunny in, so I'm just going to click and drag with the bunny, we actually get this pop-up. So this asset can only be applied to an instance layer and you do not currently have one selected, and it asks if we want to make one. I'm just going to hit cancel so I can explain what's going on here. So this is happening because I have the asset layer highlighted currently. And much like the sprites, there are rules for what the objects can go on. So we remember that backgrounds can contain an image. Asset layers can contain multiple assets, multiple different types of assets even. So we can have tree assets and bunny assets. And then instance layers are where we put our actual objects. So I'm going to click on my instances layer that already exists. If you don't have one, you're going to want to create one right here. But yeah, then I can actually drag my bunny over into the world. Again, it is worth remembering that that object is different to the sprite. So while I can click now on my object bunny and expect it to obey my logic, the sprite in the asset layer isn't going to do that. I'm actually going to get rid of that just to avoid the confusion now. Head back to my instances layer and position it where it had the sprite. Also worth pointing out that I can have multiple instances of my bunny. So I'm going to go ahead and drag in a couple more. And all of those have their own properties, much like how when I drag in multiple sprites, they also have their own properties. So objects can also have a scale. And you can see a lot more of them here. So they can have properties of their sprites. So I can manipulate them much like I manipulate a sprite. So I can change their rotation, I can change their tint. But all of these will perform the logic of the object. They are just instances of that object. So much like we have concepts in the real world of objects. So for example, a cat. We have an idea of what a cat is. You know, it's a four-legged mammal with a tail, fur, it meows. And then we have actual instances of those objects that have further different properties. So we might have an orange tabby cat that is very temperamental. We might have a very loving black cat that likes a lot of affection and is very talkative, and so on. So we can have instances of an object that have certain behaviors of the object, but adapt to them in certain ways. So on that note, if we run the game, our instances of that object exist. And if we go ahead and I'm actually going to click over here, just to prove a point. So remember that our logic of if this then that, so that is a specific if. So that is if I click on the bunny, so not just click in the world. So if I click on this bunny, it will delete itself. If I click on this one, and so on. So I think actually that one was clicking on both of the bunnies. So they both accepted that input and they both destroyed themselves. So quite worth pointing out that if we head back to our bunny, this left click event is specifically if we click on the object, which is dependent on its sprite too. So however big the sprite is if we click within the bounds of the sprite. If you did want just clicking in the room, you would have to use a global mouse event. So if we globally left click, which just means globally anywhere in the room, not local to the object. So we've got our first bit of logic working. Now, there are a lot of properties that you can kind of play with here. So I'm going to just show a little short list of properties that you can set and have a little bit of a play with. So if you wanted to change its scale when we click on it, if you wanted to change its sprite into something else, you could do it by playing with these variables. I am going to actually change its speed and direction to get it to move. So these are what's called a built-in variable in GameMaker. So these are variables or properties that all objects have. They're not necessarily using them, so they're not necessarily moving right now. All objects by default, for example, have a speed and direction, but they start off not moving anywhere. So we're going to change that for the bunny. We're going to move the bunny, get it moving when we click on it. So I'm going to set its speed, and you can actually see now that that variable, we call it, so the property, speed, comes up green. And that lets us know that it is a built-in variable. Now, if we just write speed, that doesn't actually do anything. Remember that we have to be really specific when we are writing our code. So we have to tell it to actually do something. So it's not a complete sentence yet, essentially. So let's set it to something. So let's tell it, change your speed equal to, and then a number. So again, I am also spacing out all of my punctuation here. So I'm doing speed and then a space equals, another space, and then 3. And then I'm putting a semicolon to end my sentence. So I'm doing all of this for readability and to follow conventions that other users of GameMaker, GML, and JavaScript use. Technically, you don't have to have the spaces. GameMaker will still compile and you won't hit any errors if you don't, but I just want to explain again, that's why I'm doing it. It's just to follow convention and because I'm used to it, and in other languages, some of the code editors actually kind of force the conventions on you. As you write your code, it sort of updates the spacing for you. So now that we've done that, let's hit play again. And click on a bunny. And yeah, you can see that as soon as I click on a bunny, any of these particular bunnies, they move off in this direction. Now, if I wanted it to move in a different direction, I would have to change its direction property. What it's currently doing is actually 0. So that's the default direction that it's pointing to. So that is using the unit circle, right? So the right direction, so heading off to our right east, is actually 0. So if we want to go up, for example, that is 90. So if we do that and have another look, we go up. So like I said, have a little bit of a play with some of those settings. I am going to go ahead and finish my kind of joke and use the instance destroy on an object of my cover to finish the joke, so that when I click on the cover, it disappears and it actually reveals why the bunny crossed the road. So you have the final joke revealed here. Why did the bunny cross the road? It was to go to Bunnings. I do apologize as that is a very Australian joke, but there it is. Thank you for watching and I will catch you in another video.